Hello, and welcome to Ex Cult Ed, the podcast where I share my experiences, thoughts, and feelings after leaving the truth, otherwise known as the 2x2 way, the fellowship, the one true way. You get the picture. My hope is that in sharing this, it will be cathartic for me and perhaps make you, dear listener, feel less alone if you've been through or are going through something similar. This is my story. Today I want to talk about boundaries because it's been something I've been struggling with a lot over the past year. I want to start with what is a boundary? My understanding of a boundary is knowing what is and isn't comfortable to you and what you are and aren't willing to accept, and then communicating that with the person you're in a relationship with. This doesn't have to be an intimate relationship. It could be friendships, work relationships, family relationships, whatever. One thing I've had to understand about myself is that I grew up in a cult where it was always my duty to sacrifice myself for others. Saying no was rarely an option. We weren't taught about what was and wasn't acceptable behavior from other people. We were taught to turn the other cheek and forgive, just like Jesus did. I mean, the person we worshipped was unfairly nailed to a cross for God's sake, literally. Standing up for ourselves wasn't the focus. Being meek and humble and keeping the peace was our goal. I even remember a worker preaching about having a spirit of acceptance. We were taught to be people pleasers. The love we received from our families, friends, and our Father in heaven was all conditional on us behaving in a certain way, which sometimes made us feel uncomfortable. I was raised to not understand, respect, or value my own boundaries. But how can I expect others to value my boundaries if I don't? For myself, boundaries were taboo because I didn't have enough of a sense of self-worth to even consider that I might have boundaries. I felt guilty thinking about and communicating my needs. I felt like I was a burden and too much if I ever needed anything. After all, our whole existence was for serving God and living for others. It was borderline ludicrous to even consider the concept of having our own needs, let alone boundaries. After all, our own personal desires didn't matter. Rather, we were taught to squash our own selfish desires and not act on them. The focus was more about not doing things we wanted, rather than stopping others from doing what they wanted to us. Added to that, we lived under a strict purity culture, where the onus was placed on the women to cover up. We were told not to show shoulders, stomachs, thighs. The burden was on us to not dress in a way that would attract attention. And I've come to realize that the message we received from that was that we had no rights to our own body and what we wanted to do with it. If we wanted to protect our body, we had to make sure we didn't get attention. That kind of messaging teaches young women that if they get unwanted attention, it's their fault. In no way were we taught what sexual assault was, how to deal with it, or that it wasn't our fault if someone wanted to cross our boundaries. In fact, we didn't even know what our boundaries were. In another episode, I talked about a father and son both grabbing my butt and me not understanding that this was not my fault and it wasn't okay. I didn't know how to speak up because I didn't know that I could even have that boundary and that I should not expect people to touch me in that way. The only advice that I got after that incident was to stay away from them, which taught me that it was my fault and that I couldn't tell people when they made me feel uncomfortable because I couldn't expect them to respect that. Another factor in the lack of boundaries was that everybody knew what you were doing, when you were away, who you were dating, who you smiled at. Everything was everyone's business all the time. And boundaries were often crossed and rarely talked about. Not only did we have to answer to God for everything we did and didn't do, but we had to answer to each other as well. In fact, up until this year, I didn't realize I had the ability, let alone the right, to set boundaries in my friendships and relationships, and that I don't always have to explain myself. Also, having the preacher stay in your home once a year meant that we as members didn't really have boundaries. Those who were telling us how we should live and behave were in our homes seeing exactly how we lived and behaved. We had meetings at least twice a week, so we were seeing each other a lot. And if someone couldn't attend a meeting, they were always asked if they were away or sick. In fact, if you couldn't attend a meeting, you were required to call ahead and tell them that you were sick or away or whatever your excuse was. I personally remember feeling extremely guilty because I couldn't attend a meeting due to my mental health, and at no point did I think that it was okay for me to take that space. So I was thinking about why I haven't set boundaries much before, and I believe it's because it was a way to keep safe. And particularly for me who has abandonment issues and who doesn't have a stable family around me, I had a huge fear of being alone. This meant that I accepted any behavior towards me in relationships because all I wanted was to be safe and stable. But over this past year, I've worked really hard on developing stable friendships and support networks, which has meant I'm now able to act less from a place of fear. This has been very hard, and I have had moments and days and weeks and months where I regress back to that place of fear, and I want to go back to what is safe and secure, even if that hurts me and perhaps others too. All my life, I've been living with the mindset of putting others above myself. So when I've been meeting people, my focus had been all about how could I make them happy and keep them around, rather than thinking about my own needs and wants. In the past, if someone wanted something from me, I'd feel guilty if it was something I felt uncomfortable giving. I felt like I owed them that thing, or at least a good explanation as to why I didn't want to do it. Before now, I didn't have enough self-worth to believe that I could set boundaries and that people should just respect them. I thought that setting any kind of boundary meant that I would lose people. But now I know that the people you lose because of your boundaries are people you want to lose anyway. But all of this has resulted in me letting things happen without thinking about how I feel about it, because I figured that this is what normal people do, and I just wanted to be a normal person. For example, I met this guy on a dating app, and after meeting a few times, I went to his house. I told him that I had had a lot of trouble with consent and I really wanted to take things slow. And he reassured me that nothing would happen, that I would be safe. However, when I got to his house, things just happened without me having the time to think about if I wanted them to happen. And because I hadn't set any strict boundaries with myself beforehand, I just let it happen, even though I felt uncomfortable. Afterwards, I felt very used, and I didn't speak to this person again. I also didn't learn from the experience because I was so traumatized and I didn't have anybody to talk it through with. Since then, I had another similar experience, but at least I learned from that one. The first thing I learned is that it is absolutely okay to have boundaries. And the second thing I learned is that knowing and setting your own boundaries is also very important. And the third thing I learned for myself is that it is really hard to communicate and stick to your boundaries under pressure, especially if you haven't had any role modeling or experience in doing so. So this is something that is going to take practice. I personally have struggled a lot with working out and setting boundaries. One factor in this is that I don't really know how relationships work outside the cult, something I'm still learning. So in my experience using the dating apps, I've been going in without much thought as to what to expect, because I had no idea what to expect. I also really had no level of self-worth and self-assurance about what my boundaries were and how to stand up for them. One big fear I had was that I might come across as a prude if I didn't want to get physical with someone too early. And that comes from a place of my own insecurity and from being in the cult, knowing how we did dating there versus not knowing how fast things progress in the dating world outside the cult. But one thing I'm coming to understand is that there is no right and wrong way. And even if the rate I want to progress at is slow, that is my individual preference, and I can and should be able to communicate that to another person. And if that isn't for them, then they aren't for me. I don't want to fall into the trap of being a people pleaser and compromising my own boundaries early on in meeting people in order to gain their favor. I need to know my worth and say, I'm not okay with this. So coming up with boundaries and communicating them has been very hard for me because I barely know what my boundaries are. I'm still learning what is and isn't okay. Things that are obvious to those outside the cult are not obvious to me because I was never shown or told. For example, I recently learned that it is not acceptable to feel pressured into sex in any way. It's not okay to have sex with someone just because they want it. I'm learning how to stand up for myself and unapologetically state what I am and aren't comfortable with. And if there's a lot of things that I don't want to do, that's okay. I am more than sex, and I'm worth more than sexual acts. In the past year, I've had multiple sexual interactions, and very few of them were ones that I planned. Mostly they were acts that I fell into and wasn't equipped on how to communicate properly that I wasn't comfortable. I've learned that people take your consent to start an act, and then it can lead into another act that you're not comfortable with. And that is where I need to learn where my boundaries are and how to communicate to stop that behavior when I'm not comfortable. The unfortunate thing for me in the past is that the actions have happened too fast for me to process and control the situation. And like a true ex-cult member, I've always blamed myself when things happen and get out of control. But now I'm learning and reflecting on how I can better set my own boundaries and practice communicating them, because I've also learned that I can't expect people to constantly ask what I want and what is comfortable to me, although that would be nice and ideal. In fact, one tactic I could put in place is to ask people to constantly ask what I want and what is comfortable to me. I also think another important factor in communicating boundaries is to tell them what you are okay with. So I'm not okay with having sex early on, or I'm not okay with kissing early on, but I am okay with cuddling, and I just want to keep it at that for a while. Then they know exactly what I want, and if they push that boundary, then I know that they're not the person for me. I think the first step, which is very hard for someone like me, is to actually think about what I want and what I'm comfortable with. I have to know that inside myself before I can ask that from other people. And when you've grown up all your life being told what you want and feel is irrelevant, it's actually really hard to think about what you want without feeling like you might be a burden or too much to deal with. But I believe that the right people will understand that. I also think that I have the tendency to gaslight myself. So when I think about my own needs and attachment style, I feel like I am perhaps too needy or too sensitive, and I try to just deal with it on my own. But the right person will show up for me and have these hard conversations with me and find a way that we can both feel loved and secure. And I think I need to work on building up that sense of self-worth where I feel that it's okay to ask for my needs to be met and to recognize when I don't feel comfortable. Because back in the cult, it didn't matter what happened to us. We were under God's protection and everything was in His care. But now I have to remember that I am under my own protection. It is up to me to take responsibility for making sure I protect myself and I communicate with others what I need from them. This is not going to be easy for me, and it's something I'm still working on. I think it will take a lot of practice and a lot of moving forwards and taking a few steps back. I think too, I've been scared to bring up specific conversations, especially things that relate to my own trauma or issues. I've been scared to bring them up because of fear of rejection and fear that someone might say that I'm just ridiculous and too much. However, I'm learning that I get more hurt by not communicating what I need and what hurts me than if I just say what my issues are and how I feel about things. That way, we have a starting point to work from. Sometimes the things I feel are extreme and perhaps unrealistic, but if I don't communicate them, the other person and myself can't work through them together to find out how we can both get our needs met in a healthy way. Something I want to try with my relationships moving forward is to take a minute to think about my boundaries and how things make me feel. It could even be a specific way someone talks to me that makes me feel like less of a person. And I want to try to communicate that in a non-blaming way, of course. I've just been so used to staying silent and smiling through whatever people say or do. So this speaking up when I'm uncomfortable is going to take work. I'm sure I'm going to mess it up and come across too harsh sometimes, and other times I'm going to freeze up and not say anything and still feel really small inside. But it's a work in progress. And I think perhaps even a starting point is to say to people that sometimes I just want to pause and take a minute to reflect on what just happened and how I feel about it. Another thing I want to start thinking about is what my consequences are. Because I think not only is it important to know what my boundaries are and then think about how I'm going to communicate them in a constructive way, but also what will I do if another person crosses my boundaries? Which boundaries am I willing to work through with that person if they cross them? For example, yelling at me or saying hurtful things or name-calling in arguments, to me that isn't a deal breaker. I would be willing to talk about that and work through it, but how many times would I allow that to happen before I say, I'm sorry, this isn't working for me? And then what if they cross a physical boundary? Would I be willing to talk about that and work through it, or would that be a hard no, that this person isn't for me? So right now I'm in the process of figuring out what I am and am not willing to accept in order to set my boundaries. But I'm also working through what the consequences are if someone breaches my boundaries, especially if they do so after I've talked about them. How do I approach these situations when someone crosses my boundary in a way that makes me feel good afterwards? Can I have a discussion with them and make it clear that if this happens again, we'll have to take more drastic action? Or is that a particular boundary where the consequence is the end of the relationship? It really depends on each particular boundary and how often it gets crossed, and how the crossing of that boundary makes me feel. But this boundary thing isn't specific to romantic relationships and physical boundaries, although that's my main focus and the place that I want to grow in right now. It relates to all areas of life. If someone is saying or doing something that makes me feel uncomfortable, allowing it to happen, I feel, is a learned trauma response. All my life, I've been taught to disrespect my own boundaries, but feeling uncomfortable to make others feel comfortable is not okay. I think for everyone leaving the cult, it's important to take some time and think about what sort of behavior you expect, want, and need from other people. What sort of boundaries do I want to set with my friends and family still in the cult? And what sort of boundaries do I want to put in place with the new relationships I'm developing out in the world? And that is regardless of what people tell us is normal and not normal behavior, because we're coming from a different place, and the right people will understand that. For me personally, I found that setting boundaries with people outside the cult is a lot more difficult because I have no confidence in my social skills talking to people outside. The more I'm doing it, the more I'm realizing that people are just people. And we're actually quite good at socializing because we were forced to do it so often. It's just that the conversation is now whatever we want it to be. It's also difficult because I was desperate to make good friends and keep people around. But I've found a few good people now, and that desperation is fading, and I'm naturally making more and more good friends. Plus, I have a newfound confidence in my ability to meet people and build connections. So don't be like me and don't compromise all your boundaries just to keep people in your life. You do not need to have sex with someone or do them favors or feel uncomfortable just to make them like you or to feel worthwhile. You are worthwhile simply just by being. I fell into this trap for a long time thinking I had to prove my worth to others. Now I'm taking the time to step back and also allow others to prove that they actually value me as a person for who I am and not how much I can please them. I think extreme social anxiety after leaving the cult is probably normal, given that if we did anything that went against the rules of the group, we would be shunned by its members, who were our only real connections in the world. Last year, I realized I was going into my relationships with the same mindset, extremely scared that if I did anything wrong, they'd shun me. This meant that I was so scared to discuss my own feelings, my own trauma, my needs, because what if I was too much? But now I have to believe that I will find the people who love me for me and who don't think I'm too much. I have to believe that I'm worthy of love and I'm worthy of respect and that my boundaries are completely reasonable and okay. Recently, I've made some amazing friends who are supporting me through understanding, setting, communicating, and enforcing my own boundaries, and this is extremely empowering. Learning to say no in any situation is a huge deal after being in the cult, and I'm really proud of myself. I still allow my boundaries to be crossed from time to time, and it feels horrible, but I'm so thankful for friends I can debrief with and use those situations as learning opportunities to move forward in a healthy way. A good friend recently said something to me that has now become my new mantra. Progress, not perfection. And that's where I'm at now. There are things I've had to learn and I'm still learning. And one is that my voice and my opinions are important even if nobody agrees. Two is that I am worthy of love, and perhaps the first step is to learn to love myself. And yes, relationships take work, but I should never have to make myself do something that I feel deeply uncomfortable with in order to gain or keep someone's love. I'm learning to celebrate my progress while also taking notes from my failures. I'm learning to go easier on myself. Yes, I've made a lot of stupid and naive decisions. And yes, I've gotten hurt and I've hurt others along the way. And yes, I'm going to learn from that. And no, I can't promise I won't make the same mistakes again, but I can try my hardest to do better. And finally, I'm working on my assertiveness. I'm working on communicating my needs and when I don't want to do things. Yes, I'm still falling short sometimes, and yes, my boundaries still get crossed. But practicing saying no is very important and something I really need to work on, because each time I say no, it reinforces to me that I deserve to be listened to. And more importantly, I deserve to listen to myself. When the inner me doesn't want something, it deserves to be heard. And if anyone doesn't respect my no, that doesn't say anything about me and my worth. That just tells me what sort of person they are. I think the main thing I want to get across in this episode, and the main thing I want to learn myself, is that it is completely okay to say no to anything for any reason. You do not have to feel any guilt about saying no, especially if the thing you're saying no to is something that makes you physically or emotionally uncomfortable. Also, for those of you who might meet some of us ex-culters, please understand how hard it is for us to say no, and maybe try to read between the lines and learn how we say no without saying no. Maybe even just help us feel comfortable saying no. Perhaps have a discussion with us about what your boundaries are in different types of relationships and help us articulate ours. It would even be helpful if you ask us how often we want you to check in with us and what situations we specifically want you to check in with us. I think having these conversations and being a safe person for us to feel out our own boundaries and practice communicating them would be extremely helpful and something that I personally would really appreciate. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate you. If you'd like to reach out, ask any questions, vent, say whatever you need to say, even if that's getting annoyed about something I've said, email me at exculted@gmail.com. That's exculted@gmail.com. And always remember, you can walk your own way, speak your own truth, and live your own life. Bye!